with the subject?
Well, I genuinely think that this trend that you've rightly summarized with those two examples, and by the way, there was also a newspaper report in India saying that there is serious talk about the Prime Minister having spoken to some senior officials and said, we have to ensure that we don't have the same vulnerabilities that we had because of dependence on outside sources, and we have to strengthen our own production, manufacturing capacities, and so on. I think that more and more countries are going to turn towards the mantra of self-reliance that we followed from 1947 and only gave up in 91 or diluted in 91. And I think this is going to be a real challenge. I mean, there's no question that globalization is facing this resurgence of nationalisms, of reassertions of sovereignties, and unfortunately, as a corollary, an abandonment of global connections and global responsibilities as well. I would rather have preferred that at the end of this pandemic, which may take months more than we are contemplating right now, that the globe would actually sit down collectively to learn lessons about what happened, about how international institutions and systems can be strengthened and reformed, as we discussed earlier, forestall its recurrence, and at the same time to be able to say, look, there's some things we got messed up in, some things we can do better. Let's come to an agreement about that. But somehow I don't see that happening. It's what I'd like to see happen. It's what I hope the Secretary General will call for. I hope WHO will be part of. I hope India will take a lead in. India is a country, as you rightly said in your answer just now, that has an ability to provide governance solutions to the development needs of millions from Asia and Africa. So India could have a very influential voice in reshaping globalization. But if that newspaper report is right, we ourselves are talking about throwing up higher barriers rather than, because we see these international connections as having revealed vulnerabilities in the time of COVID. The disruption of supply chains also hurt us, the unavailability of certain goods. Right now, even things like PPE, personal protective equipment for healthcare workers, we're trying to import stuff from countries that are being held up in those countries for military reasons. And people are going to say, why don't we have the capacity at home instead? Well, that's a totally different conversation. But my fear is that globalization is going to take a very severe blow in the solar plexus from this entire experience.
Let me take you back to the UN and pose you two questions. One, of course, in your current role as the chair of the Parliamentary Committee on Information Technology. And my question to you there is that as we move towards an era, as we move away from manufacturing consent to coding consent, what is the role of sovereignty in this age? Is there a role for multilateralism, or is this a multi-stakeholder domain where companies are as powerful as countries, and hence we need to change the arena where we set the rules for the future? We are talking about the infodemic accompanying the pandemic. So in that sense, how do we ensure fake news and malicious actors don't create and don't exaggerate the cleavages that exist in societies at these moments?
Let me respond to that, because, you know, some companies are stronger and some companies are weaker. That's the actual reality, because those that are stronger, as you rightly said, the ones in the business of recycling information and producing and amassing data. They have become powerful. They're providing governments with the tools that they need. And I'll come back to that in a second. But some companies are weaker because all the multinationals have thought that they could move millions with the pulse of a cursor. They could move products. They could literally manufacture 7 different components of a laptop in 7 different countries and assemble it in an 8th. They had completely overlooked the fact that they were dependent on a working international system of cooperative sovereignties to be able to do that. The day that countries started banning from countries, the day that countries started saying that you cannot travel, that we're going to lockdown, we're going to do this or that, those supply chains collapsed because it was no longer possible to take for granted what these companies were basing their entire business model on. And I must say that those companies are weaker because they had to turn to sovereign governments for the way out, for solutions, for tax incentives, for trillion-dollar stimuluses, for various things that will help them stay afloat. So I think that in many ways, the only companies who emerge from this crisis stronger are the ones who are in the business of working with and helping governments. And of those, the key ones are the data providers, analyzers, aggregators, manipulators. they have found that governments need these tools immediately.
But how is that good for you and me? How is that good giving so much?
It's not at all good for you and me, except if one of us has met somebody who had a coronavirus infection. This kind of stuff is going to be able to trace when that guy got off a plane, trace everybody who was on the flight next to him and which rows they were sitting, find the immigration officer who processed his passport and his family and whom they have met, go to which bar he went to have a drink afterwards, he went to for a meeting, all of this stuff, because his phone, the cell phone towers in the area passed him, the GPS on his phone or in his car, all of these things.
So I think,
so you're looking, imagine after COVID is over, you think governments having created and deployed these tools to be able to follow people in this kind of intimate detail, are they going to lightly relinquish?
They're not, and that's the worry, that the liberal consensus over the past 7 decades, no matter how bad Pax Americana was, that we were pushing the needle in favor of greater personal freedom and choice. What we are seeing today is a complete reversal of that trend. And my worry is that Pax Sinica, if that was to emerge post this episode, that would be the norm. The Chinese model is now being touted in the global south as a model that works. Now, how do you respond to that?
I mean, I think that this is exactly the worry all of us have. Some of us have the same worry within our own country, Samir, but I'm not getting into domestic politics. I think many governments will see this authoritarian.
I think there's an unfair equivalence between our government and the Chinese.
No.
We can fight our battles. But here I'm asking that if there's a Chinese model on offer, which is extremely attractive to many takers, how do you sell the liberal consensus to those countries?
That's a fair question. And frankly, the Chinese model as a total composite will not be replicable in most countries in the world. But elements of the Chinese model, techniques used by the Chinese and tools used by the Chinese, and that worries me because the Chinese model has in fact significantly infringed on personal freedoms that countries like ours, which have lived in democracy for so long, have really enjoyed, valued, and taken for granted. So we don't want to lose it. We want to keep the freedom to criticize our government, to post irreverent TikTok videos or write rude tweets to the Prime Minister, to be able to express our views freely, to be able to disagree with each other, ideally in a decent way, but sometimes even with indecent trolling. All of these things that are not possible in China, but are possible here, could be compromised if those elements are taken up. So my own view is that a conscious and aware citizenry is important. We must raise our voices, and we must frankly have the moral courage to stand up and speak up for the kinds of systems we want to preserve. We fortunately have some of the institutions the Chinese don't have. We could have, for example, the Supreme Court, the right to privacy in a way that no equivalent body in China would. Have you lost my video? I'm getting a warning message that I've disappeared.
Yeah, you have disappeared, but your voice is still spectacular, so carry on.
But apparently the host has stopped my video. Can the host tell us why the host has stopped my video?
You're back. Carry on. You're back.
Okay, so what I wanted to say to the host is that I'm still here, and I made my point, but this is precisely what I was worried about, is that some unseen figure can control my camera, turn off my sound, and censor my voice in a way that we didn't think would be possible in the democracies we're living in. And we have cheerfully surrendered to technology the right to enable this host to turn off my video when I'm trying to speak to the public, trying to listen to me.
I would be a worried man if Xi Jinping could do that to Shashi Tharoor.
There you are.
Let me ask you one last question. So the Indian imperative of in some sense, providing an alternative to Pax Sinica, which is now a real possibility, and creating space within Pax Americana for greater representation and greater legitimacy. How can we build a coalition? Who do we turn to? Who are our partners? Is it Europe? Is it Japan? Is it Germany? Where are the countries through which we can create a global conversation on exactly these questions?
Well, first and foremost, and I know this is going to sound old-fashioned to an iconoclast like you, first and foremost, I think our partners are the other developing countries. But that fits into
I would agree completely.
Yeah, I think the argument that we made in the book that India could be the world's first development power rests on our ability to be useful to the the developing countries around the world. And frankly, many of them have development needs, which we have been able to meet in recent years. And therefore, we actually represent a useful model to them, at least of economic growth, of pulling people out of poverty and so on. We should ideally also be a country that can provide governance solutions to their development needs. If we did that, that would be our first natural constituency. Unlike, for example, the Chinese, who have enormous geoeconomic power, manufacturing power, control over supply chains, a massive trading power, or the US with its huge military diplomatic alliances, its dominance over the world's economic institutions. We won't have any of that. We will not be a US, we will not be a China, but we can be a different kind of power. That would require a sort of rebooting of the ethic and the method of global cooperation. We would really need, it seems to me, to respond effectively to global challenges, be a distinctive voice, an Indian voice, and at the same time to navigate ideological and political diversity in the world. It used to be said of India that we are the management of diversity. I have to say that in recent months we have been less so domestically, so we need to fix that at home as well. But we should be able to bring that skill to the world stage and work with a diverse world and navigate it better. In any case, we have to be a voice for telling people you can be strong nationally, we respect your sovereignty, but don't abandon your global responsibilities. COVID was actually illustrative of a global problem that no one country could have solved on its own. The very fact that Mr. Trump can point fingers at the Chinese or even at a UN body like the WHO shows that implicitly they also have a responsibility for the well-being of people in Mr. Trump's country. That's precisely the point that India can stand for.
Great. So there are a number of questions headed your way and our way. I'm not going to ask you the question on MP lags because that will take the rest of the evening. But I will certainly ask you a question on some of the conspiracies that have been doing the rounds.
Okay, let me just say on the MP lads.
You have 30 seconds.
On Twitter, my first pinned tweet is my op-ed on the subject. Please read it. I've said everything I want to say in that picture.
Yes. Now, so that's why I don't want to go into MP lads. But what is the possibility of the coronavirus being a bioweapon? Let me add something to that. Even if it's not a bioweapon, what if it was a virus that people were experimenting with it in the labs? Do we have systems to manage this? Do we have transparency, accountability, or even a global cooperation to mitigate
Well,
this?
in theory, yes, but in practice, not really. There is a biological weapons convention, and you may remember when the Americans first went after the Iraqis. It was not just about the nuclear thing. It was an allegation that they were manufacturing biological weapons in certain factories. That first factory that Clinton bombed in the 90s was bombed because it was supposed to be manufacturing biological weapons. The Sunnis said it, the Chinese, the Iraqis said it turned out to be a factory that was actually manufacturing talcum powder or something for cosmetic purposes. Anyway, be that as it may, biological weapons have been outlawed, but that unfortunately does not seem to have prevented a handful of very powerful countries from continuing to research them. Whether the virus from Wuhan was a biological weapon that went wrong or that escaped the control of people, or whether, as some of the more sinister theories suggest, that it was deliberately unleashed, or third, whether something between the two, that some disgruntled elements may have unleashed it without the wish of the overall government and they had to hastily curb it, etc. Whatever the story is, none of this is proven. And I tend, from my long experience of world affairs, to say that in my own experience, cock-ups are far more common than conspiracies, and that to actually assume that the nasty things that happen in the world are because of conspiracies actually gives more credit to malign than they probably deserve.
Thank you.
So I'm still inclined to think that it's not a conspiracy. But do you have a different view?
I tend to agree with you. I think it was not a bioweapon, and I hope Mridula Prayaga, who has asked this question, got her answer. And let me pose a question to you from Nitin Goyal. He says, do you think even within a nation, you will see the fragmentation of governance with local governments, state governments beginning to assert sub-sovereign impulses?
That's a very good question. But if you're looking at our nation, we already have a mixed answer. The Prime Minister invoked the National Management Act, under which he was essentially able to declare a nationwide lockdown in a way that Mr. Trump in America could not, because the state governments there have not have greater sovereign power than our state governments in India do. And that's a very interesting distinction because we're both federal systems. Obviously, in a unitary country, that issue doesn't come up. So when we talk about state governments and local governments, you're only talking about large federal systems. My answer would be that what is desirable would be more decision making at the bottom level, at the grassroots, and more coordination on nationwide policy.
So going back to the original fundamental idea of a third tier of governance being the most important part of how we manage society.
Absolutely. But then that only works if they also have resources, if they have the budgetary controls that they don't currently have at the lowest levels. State governments right now, for example, you saw what happened just 2 days ago. The Telangana Chief Minister announces that he wants to extend the lockdown in Telangana till the 3rd of June. Suddenly, somebody must have called him from Delhi because in a few hours he says, no, this is my recommendation to the central government. I think it's very desirable. Clearly, somebody from Delhi told him, boss, if one state extends a lockdown and other states as a result of a national policy don't, the country can't function. So you better give us your input and the government will decide for the whole country. Now, this kind of mixed messaging is the case right now in COVID. We'll have to see. But the desirable outcome to the gentleman, Mr. Goyal, who asked the question, is undoubtedly that the best solution would be one where you have strong decentralization of authority coupled with effective coordination at the national level. And the same would apply globally. Strong states that can cooperate globally.
So let me pose another question from someone who identifies as Delegate Mun. How important is it to motivate people at the time of this pandemic?
Oh, very. And I think, that's one point. I'm a critic of the Prime Minister on a number of things, but
That's habitual. You're a habitual.
Yeah. I'm a habitual critic, but I have to take my hat off for the fact that he has consistently tried to motivate people. My only complaint was that motivation should not only be symbolic, it should also involve substantive information, that the Prime Minister should tell people, look, this is a concern, this is your problem, this is my problem, this is what we're doing, these are the factors I'm weighing in my mind, because every decision he announces impacts people.
You'll be surprised, I agree with you. I agree with you on this. Crisis communication involves both motivation and information.
Correct.
And it has
information can be motivating.
Poetry of Rhapsodies poses the question. No, I am not going to ask you that. We have already engaged with that. That was on the MP Lads. Please read his opinion piece.
Poetry and Rhapsodies, alas, are what's been denied to us.
So now, we have a question from Isha. Does this pandemic, and we discussed this, so it's a short answer for you. Does this pandemic also tell us that there is a need to diversify where manufacturing and business hubs are within the country? So we talked about the global landscape.
No, I think we have to kickstart manufacturing, and I think it'll be happening even while the lockdown is going on in many parts.
She's talking about diversification of the hubs. It's still very concentrated in Ahmedabad and Chennai and certain hubs, NCR.
I mean, I think 40% of the nation's manufacturing is in 3 states: Gujarat, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu. So, clearly there is a case for more diversification, but it's difficult to do this top-down, young lady, because every businessman opening a factory has considerations. And some policy of diversification is not the consideration. It will be access to raw materials, availability of labor, good facilities, decent infrastructure. And so that's why these 3 states are winning. Of course, the government can help diversification by giving tax incentives, by saying if you go and locate this in Chhattisgarh rather than Ahmedabad, we'll give you a tax holiday for 5 years. Something like that. You can do stuff like this. But short of government policy giving incentives, every business person, industrialist, manufacturer will have to make his or her own calculations on the basis of economic.
We have 3 minutes left. We have lots of questions, but let me try and pick one randomly. How long can this lockdown be handled efficiently? So how long?
Houston, your guess is as good as mine. I think that very clearly.
And this is by Om Parikh.
Okay, but Mr. Parikh, in places where there is consciousness of this virus. For example, I keep getting frantic messages of people saying, with the next building across the road in Bombay, 5 people have got the virus. People like that, they'll accept the lockdown. I was talking to a senior colleague in my party, his district in Orissa. Nobody in the village has COVID and they don't understand why they're being locked down. So I think the short answer is we can sustain it definitely for a much longer period in places where the virus has struck and people are conscious of the dangers of lifting it. It'll be difficult to sustain it in those places where people don't see the immediate danger, don't see any reason for concern. And this is why many of the proposals that are going around today about lifting the lockdown are suggesting a varied pattern of response, with different areas being identified for different kinds of treatment, different sectors being encouraged. So reopening of factories, reopening of tea shops, allowing agricultural workers back into the fields so the crops don't rot in the fields. All of these things are being encouraged by people, while saying that any hotspot cluster, any place where there's been even one infection in the last week, will have to remain under lockdown. People of a certain age, certain medical history will have to remain on lockdown, so on and so forth. So it'll be an uneven answer, but you can't have a nationwide lockdown, definitely, for the reasons.
So the last question to you, and this is from me to you. This is not from the audience. There are Rudra Chandran, who I apologize we couldn't take your question. Saira Chaudhary as well. She questions the role of the media and whether it's doing a fair job.
It's not.
But let me ask you a question from my side. You started by saying that there were certain fundamental differences in your and my approach to current India. What is it that where we share a common? Where is the common platform that allowed us to write this book together?
Yeah.
What was it that we share in common that allowed us to take this project together?
No, I think both of us had two absolute convictions in common. One was that global governance was an extremely important subject, and that it had not been going very well in recent years, and that the time to reboot global governance had come, and that could not be with the same existing structures. So that conviction was one half of the book, or 2/3 of the book. The final bit was our conviction that from what we know of India's potential, India's capacity, India's human resources, technological resources, diplomatic resources, that India could play a much bigger role on the world stage than it's been playing so far, and that it could do so in the context of a global reboot of the new world, or of the world order. So those two convictions united us. We could always differ on nuance. I think there are some arguments in the book where you have used language that may be tougher than I would have used.
Actually, you accused me of being left of center. You accused me of being fundamentally left of center while writing the book.
Well, on some considerations globally, your view was very much the sort of subaltern left, not just the intellectual left. But that's fun. That makes the book so much more readable. I would say that at the end of the day, our differences are differences of emphasis, and particularly of time-sensitive issues, but the fundamental long-term analysis remains solid, and we do agree. So please read The New World Disorder and The Indian Imperative.
Great, and thanks a lot, all of you, for joining us. And it's been a pleasure to be able to speak to all of you. We hope that we see light at the end of the tunnel soon, and we are actually able to physically go pick up the book and have a book discussion where Shashi and I can actually meet you. Till such time, continue tuning into Jaipur Literature Festival's digital initiatives, and Sanjay Roy, who will continue to enthrall us all. Sanjay, over to you.
Brave New World.
Thank you so much, Samir. And this hand behind the screen, so to speak, disconnected your video because your connection was stable. So every time something goes stable, we take it off so the audio can continue. But absolutely,
so you're shaking my stability here, Sanjay. This is precisely what I have to worry about.
Just a few.
Only the internet connection, Dr. Tharoor, and perhaps as part of your chair, the committee that you chair, you will look into some of these connectivity issues when you
We need to desperately enhance bandwidth in this country.
Have to, otherwise. 8 o'clock with Helena Kennedy in conversation with B. Rowlatt, and that's about freedom of thought. One of our foundational human rights, freedom of thought, protects the individual conscience of every human being. In conversation with writer and broadcaster B. Rowlatt, Baroness Helena Kennedy QC explores the need to protect the forum internum, our private and mental space, from the incursions of digital technology. So remember, join us. Till then, please retweet, come back online. Thank you, Shashi. Thank you, Samir. From all of us at JLF, Brave New World, stay safe and log back on. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.